Without doubt, you will have heard the phrase security guarantees this week many, many times. Those guarantees are what Ukraine's President Zelensky wants from President Trump in exchange for a minerals deal with Ukraine, as Ukraine hopes to bring an end to the war in Russia, which has just entered its fourth year. The war has been the subject of high-level discussions this week at the White House, at the United Nations and in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And that's the basis of this week's security brief with Mikey Kay, former assault helicopter pilot and strategic military planner in the British military. So, Mikey, a huge amount to talk about this week in relation to Ukraine alone, and some latest lines from President Trump, I understand, that you want to bring us tonight.
Yeah, just when you thought the rhetoric couldn't be ratcheted up even further, and you've already got European leaders scrabbling, we've got, quote, Donald Trump saying the EU, quote, the EU was formed in order to screw the US, but I can say that I'm now president, unquote. It just keeps on evolving with the rhetoric. So now we kind of have Putin, has been antagonized since 91 and the fracture of the Soviet Union, who's been wanting a fragmentation of NATO in Europe ever since. And now you've got the US president, an ally for, US being an ally for 80 years, now coming out with this rhetoric. So again, European leaders are going to get their heads around the table and they're going to start figuring out what this means. Yeah,
that fragmentation was exactly what an earlier guest this hour, retired US Brigadier General, was expressing to me, that concern about the fracturing of organisations like NATO. Well, we saw earlier this week that there was a lot of activity going on in New York and Washington. President Macron was in the White House meeting President Trump. That slightly on the day overshadowed what was happening at the United Nations. So let's reflect back on that a little bit more now with our North America correspondent, Neda Tawfik. Hi there, Neda. Good to have you with us on the security brief. Let's try and break this down because there's a lot to go through. And let's talk about the United Nations General Assembly and the votes that took place there earlier this week. What were the headlines from that?
Yeah, well, essentially what you had was the United States joining Russia, Belarus and North Korea to vote against a Ukrainian General Assembly resolution that had been negotiated for over a month. It was supposed to be a really symbolic gesture to mark the third year of Russia's invasion and just to reaffirm the General Assembly's support for Ukraine's borders, for calling for Russia to withdraw its forces. But instead, the United States made clear it wasn't going to support that draft. So again, voted with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea against it. And at the same time, they put forward their own competing draft. And in the General Assembly hall, they actually urged countries not to support the European resolution and to support theirs. And what that meant was that the European resolution got far less support than in past years, with many countries abstaining because of U.S. threats. But on the other hand, it meant that Europe had to kind of work against the United States to propose amendments to that U.S. resolution. They wanted to make it clear that Russia was to blame, that there needed to be a just peace in Ukraine, that there couldn't be a change to Ukraine's borders. And in the General Assembly, a majority of states did support those European amendments, which then meant there was this very awkward situation, something I haven't seen in all my time covering the United Nations, where the U.S. then abstained on their own resolution because they were unhappy with the changes made to it by those European amendments.
Neda, what are the outcomes of those two votes in the General Assembly, both on the European and Ukraine proposal and the US proposal that only got through because of the amendment you just alluded to? What does that now mean in reality with how the United Nations move forward with effectively the vote and the opinion of the GA?
Yeah, I think it tells us a number of things. General Assembly resolutions, let's remember, they are symbolic. They aren't legally binding, but it gives us a sense of where the world stands. And again, so many nations were willing to abstain on this vote. But I think this says something larger about Europe's relationship with the United States. We've spoken a lot about some of the major fault lines that have developed. Well, I was speaking to many diplomats when Donald Trump was elected at the UN about what they expected. And many of them said, look, the rhetoric during campaigning is ultimately different than actions when an administration gets into office. Well, here at the United Nations, we saw that Donald Trump's administration isn't just talking about a different approach when it comes to Ukraine and trying to put pressure for an eventual peace deal. They are willing to actively work and get different alliances at the UN and work against their own allies to get their strategy in place.
Neda, bring in then for us what happened at the Security Council.
Yeah, well, the Security Council, remember, is the most powerful body of the United Nations. It's where laws are made, essentially. And the United States took the same resolution of theirs. It was just 3 short paragraphs that simply called for a swift end to the war and a lasting peace. They brought that to the Security Council as well. Now, in that meeting, the Europeans made it very clear that the United States put this through in a rushed way, in their view, that they had no time to negotiate, that Europe's security wasn't taken into account. And the British and French ambassadors actually called for a vote to postpone that vote on the U.S. resolution. Now, ultimately, China was in agreement that they could take more time, but Russia and the U.S., again, were on the same side against Europe, saying that a vote needed to happen. Ultimately, that resolution, without any amendments, was passed in the Security Council, but with all 5 of Europe's Security Council members abstaining on that vote, and Russia and the United States raising their hands together to push it through. And ultimately, that was the first Security Council resolution on Ukraine.
Neda, if I may, I mean, obviously the US and Russia were threatening to put a veto in if the amendment was included. Why weren't France and the UK, for example, not threatening to veto the other way?
You know, there was a big question among, correspondents at the UN about what the UK and France would do. They also hold veto power in the Council. But let's remember that the UK and France haven't used their veto in decades, and they hold that as a real point of pride. I think the big question going forward, though, is can they survive 4 years of the Trump administration without using their veto if we see more decisions on European security taken in this way, with the U.S. not consulting them ahead of time?
Neda, thank you so much for that. Neda Tawfik. And Mikey, let's just follow that up with a very quick thought from you, if you would, on the significance of all of this. Look, a lot of people might say the centre of power right now, where deals are really getting done, is over in the White House. So what is the significance of all of this in the United Nations?
Well, I think a lot of countries around the world, a lot of commentators, a lot of reporters, a lot of correspondents would certainly argue what the point is of the United Nations at the moment. It's almost been paralysed. We saw that in Syria. The Security Council could not vote on anything when it came to Syria, and Syria just went on and on and on, and we saw the devastating effects of that. But the one thing that I do hold hope on the United Nations is, especially the Security Council, is that whilst the Security Council may not come to a conclusion on it, there are events. So, for example, if we can bring slide up, please. There are events. This was the vote on the Security Council resolution that Nada was talking about. You can see those that voted in favour for the US proposal. You've got the US, China and Russia now voting on the same side against European countries, France, UK, Denmark, Greece and Slovenia. Now that, whilst it may not have an immediate impact from the vote, it could have an impact on the US electorate. There will be part of the US electorate looking at that and not believing that the US is now siding with Russia in these kind of resolution votes. So maybe that has a potential impact.
Let's pick up on what we were talking about there vis-a-vis Ukraine. And obviously, we've been talking a lot about a minerals deal for quite some time now. Certainly today, it's back in the headlines. Where are we on that deal? What exactly are those minerals, first of all, and where are they in Ukraine?
Yeah, so we saw Macron meeting Trump in Washington. It seems like the conversation on minerals is coming up almost every day. And now we have Ukraine saying that it's agreed to the terms of what's called a preliminary deal that would give the US access to its deposits of, it says rare earth minerals, but I think this is a good question that you ask. Let's go slide, please. This map should basically show the makeup of what we're talking about with this deal. So
there we go.
Yeah, we've got titanium, zirconium, graphite, rare earths is included in that, and lithium. But you can see from that slide that the rare earths, the green slither inside the eastern regions, is pretty minimal. But then you're talking about lithium, graphite, titanium, uranium. These all factor into this deal. So rare earths has been mentioned or not, but actually it's way greater than that. It includes oil, gas, it includes the ports, it includes infrastructure, but still as yet no guarantee for Zelensky on the security guarantee. Now, you might ask the question, what does security guarantee actually mean? Well,
it's a question we've asked many, many times and will continue to do over the days ahead, no doubt.
Yeah, for me, the security guarantee, one of the security guarantees, and the big one that Zelensky is looking for, if you can go slide, please. This is a map of the regions that that Zelensky is really interested in holding. Now, these are partially held or wholly held by Russian occupation at the moment. At the top, you've got the region of Luhansk, then you've got Donetsk. Just below that, you've got the region of Zaporizhia, and then you've got Kherson at the bottom. Now, Zelensky is giving a lot away, and the reason why he's persuaded to give a lot away is because obviously there's minerals inside those regions that he wants to hold on to. And this is important, and I think this is his strategy when he's going into a deal that gives a lot away with Trump.
Yeah, because Donald Trump said in that cabinet meeting earlier, we've already alluded to it tonight, that if there were American companies, American citizens on the ground as a result of a minerals deal, then that, I think the phrase he used was, a sort of a guarantee anyway. So is part of the strategy going to the US without that formal deal to actually get that over the line? Although, you know, the update that we've had within the last hour is we're hearing reports that President Zelensky is now saying, look, I'm not going to arrive in Washington unless I have those guarantees first.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think, Anita, there's any such thing as a gentleman's handshake with President Trump. I think European leaders will realise that by now. I think President Zelensky will realise that now. The other big component we've got going on here is you've now got Putin playing the game of upping the minerals appeal to Donald Trump. Slide.
Yeah, he is saying, isn't he, look over here too. What do we know about the offer from the Russian president versus the offer from the Ukrainian president?
Yeah, Putin extending joint exploration of US companies inside Russia, not just Russia. He's also extended an invitation for what's called joint projects inside the Arctic Circle. He's saying Russia has more rare earth minerals or resources than Ukraine. He's saying that Russia has the world's 5th largest rare earth metal reserves. And Putin is also proposing a joint hydropower and aluminium production invitation as well. So, you know, you can see the game that's being played here. If Putin can offer enough to Donald Trump on a minerals deal side, then that absolutely torpedoes any aspiration or any objective that Zelensky has to keeping those 4 regions that are currently occupied or partially occupied by Russia.
Yeah, and both presidents of Ukraine and Russia know that President Trump is a transactional president. They are looking to appeal to the deal maker in him. Speaking about the deals that President Trump keeps talking about, Mikey, let's go back to that Macron-Trump meeting in the White House earlier. President Macron was correcting the US president on a number of the figures that he was talking about in relation to what the US had spent in Ukraine. Let's listen to that.
The money to Ukraine, they get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total efforts, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
But President Trump has been repeating some of those claims, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really, really important moment to sort of just debunk some of what Trump has been saying in terms of the minerals deal. But I think more importantly is that Trump has been effectively saying that the reason he wants this minerals deal is because the US has given between $300 billion and $350 billion to Ukraine. Now, this is just absolutely factually incorrect. This slide here tells you exactly what is going on. And on the top there, with the dark blue, you have Europe. Europe have committed $132 billion. Now, it's important to say that that money lies across military, financial, and humanitarian. Not only has it committed $132 billion versus America's $114 billion, it's also now committed an extra $115 billion to Ukraine. That's Europe, whereas the United States has committed nothing. So it's definitely not 300. It's absolutely not 350 billion. It's more like 114 billion. So Trump has been using this 350 billion as a process of trying to flare up the money that America has given to Ukraine, but it's not true.
OK, let's move on. Hot on the heels of President Macron, we have, of course, the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer due in Washington, in the White House tomorrow, Thursday. As we know, the UK has announced an increase in defence spending this week. And I believe you have some new details, Mikey, on what exactly that money will go for.
Yes, I do. Before we get to that, couple of important points. The UK PM effectively announced that it would be a 13.4 billion uplift, which equates to 0.2% of GDP. That kicks in at 2027. So the big question that sort of I've had is well, what is that 13.4 billion? What is that going to be used for? It's obviously clearly too late for any deal that can be negotiated between Trump, Putin and Ukraine and Europe. But before we go into those aspects of what it could be used for, let's just have a look at what NATO countries currently spend. 3% and above, that's the darkest areas. You've got a couple of the Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, and then you've got Poland at 2.5% to 2.9%. You've effectively got a couple more countries there. The big majority sit in the 2% to 2.49%. And currently right now, that's where the UK stands, and then Spain is less than 2%. But going back to your question on what can that potentially be used for, after speaking to many sources across defence and obviously doing a lot of investigative research myself, there's a couple of areas where that uplift in UK expenditure can be used. And let's just take a look at them here. These are just some ideas based on conversations that I have. The strategic reserve, that's very important. That's the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. That effectively can support any requirements that are pulled by NATO, EU or multinational. And the ARC are basically involved in conflict prevention, peacekeeping or humanitarian. Another area of interest that I think the UK defence are increased in bolstering is the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap in the Atlantic. That bit of water at the top there, which is seeing an increased activity by Russian naval shipping, and that would be in the form of a UK carrier support group. Then you've got recap and restock. So basically the UK have 14 155mm artillery pieces, 14, Anita, not 40. So they'll obviously, an MLRS, they've given a lot to Ukraine, so they'll want to be able to bolster that. Integrated air defence system, that's radars used by Finland, Norway and the UK to basically try and pick up Russian bombers coming around the Northern Cape. And then obviously you've got the question of the nuclear deterrent. Yeah.
So what's happening with that? Is some of this increase in UK spending going to go towards that as well?
So the UK nuclear deterrent, it's a bomber submarine. It carries nuclear missiles on it that are called Trident. And this has been the debate of defence spending for decades. Do the UK have a deterrent, or does it cost too much? And can that money be spent on other things like education and welfare and so on and so forth? I mean, the reality is that every single member of the Permanent Five Security Council does have a nuclear capability. And what's really and what makes the UK deterrent the deterrent is that you have UK bomber submarines with a nuclear capability on that are in undisclosed locations around the world, and obviously, provide a threat to the likes of Putin because it's impossible to identify where they are. So, but at 0.7% of a 2.5% budget, that's a significant amount of spending. But obviously and clearly, the UK Parliament, Keir Starmer, Labour have decided that the deterrent now, more than ever, I think, is coming back into its importance.
Yeah, so they are devoting quite a chunky amount of that 2.5 increase to that. OK. Really interesting to go through all of that tonight with you, Mikey. A lot more we could talk about, but I think we've covered quite a bit of territory. Mikey Kay, thank you very much. And that is this week's The Security Brief.